When Hezekiah realized that Sennacherib also intended to attack Jerusalem, he consulted with his officials and military advisors, and they decided to stop the flow of the springs outside the city. For they said, "Why should the kings of Assyria come here and find plenty of water?" Then Hezekiah worked hard at repairing all the broken sections of the wall, erecting towers, and constructing a second wall outside the first. Then Hezekiah encouraged them by saying, "Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or discouraged because of the king of Syria or his mighty army, for there is a power far greater on our side." Yeah, just really focusing on, being able to defend themselves from a practical standpoint before the Assyrians got there, at which point then God could, kind of take over and, give them whatever victory was needed. That's one of those things where some people tend to, go to one extreme or the other, where they're so practical-minded, do everything they know they can, anything that happens, they just kind of associate with their own preparation, lack thereof, if it's a failure. And then other people will take the opposite extreme and be like, God's got this. I'm not going to prepare in any way for what I know is coming at me. I'm just going to let God handle it all. Jesus take the wheel kind of situation to the extreme. Hezekiah is walking a middle ground here. What's up, cool people? My name's Matt. Welcome back to our Bible study. 2 Chronicles 32. So, Hezekiah is still king over Judah. Things have been going well. Reopened the temple, celebrated the Passover the way it was supposed to be done for the first time in a long time. And then just last chapter, they essentially reinstituted the tithe, basically regular giving that the people were supposed to contribute from what they had to help provide for the priests and Levites who, did all the stuff in the temples, or the temple and other places where offerings were made. And yeah, that was kind of the main thing that happened in the last chapter. So I don't really know if there's too much else to say to kind of introduce this chapter here. It's part of that kind of recap again that is 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So, honestly, a lot of this has been mentioned already in previous books of the Bible, but it was being repeated for those who had been exiled or otherwise, weren't living in the land that God had promised for their people. Not too much else to say to introduce this, so here we go. 2 Chronicles chapter 32. After Hezekiah had faithfully carried out his work, King Sennacherib of Assyria invaded Judah. He laid siege to the fortified towns, giving orders for his army to break through their walls. When Hezekiah realized that Sennacherib also intended to attack Jerusalem, he consulted with his officials and military advisors, and they decided to stop the flow of the springs outside the city. They organized a huge work crew to stop the flow of the springs, cutting off the brook that ran through the fields. For they said, "Why should the kings of Assyria come here and find plenty of water?" Then Hezekiah worked hard at repairing all the broken sections of the wall, erecting towers, and constructing a second wall outside the first. He also reinforced the supporting terraces in the city of David and manufactured large numbers of weapons and shields. He appointed military officers over the people and assembled them before him in the square at the city gate. Then Hezekiah encouraged them by saying, "Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid or discouraged because of the king of Syria or his mighty army, for there is a power far greater on our side. He may have a great army, but they are merely men. We have the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles for us." Hezekiah's words greatly encouraged the people. Alright. pausing there because there's another subsection coming up in the chapter. So, I do find it a little bit surprising that Hezekiah kind of waited until he knew Sennacherib was going to attack Jerusalem to do all this stuff. Like, wouldn't you think he kind of should have been preparing to, like, help the other towns as well? Then again, you know, with Assyria having already conquered the other kingdom that was, like, the rest of the tribes of God's people, maybe focusing their efforts on the capital city was about the only realistic chance they had. Of course, that shouldn't really be a limiting factor, as he's talking about, you know, having the Lord on their side. But also from a practical standpoint, it could have easily spread them thinner and made them easier to conquer, essentially. You know, would have made it easier for the Assyrians to defeat them, being spread out in such a way. So they stopped up the water that flowed outside of the city because they knew that that was going to be the strategy, to come and kind of like lay siege to Jerusalem in this case, which generally meant like blocking off everything else that would have come from outside to try and essentially like weaken the people in the city by starving them. And then of course Hezekiah fortified defenses along the walls, had another wall built apparently, and yeah, just really focusing on, like, you know, being able to defend themselves from a practical standpoint before the Assyrians got there, at which point then God could, like, kind of take over and, you know, give them whatever victory was needed. So that's, like, that's one of those things where some people tend to, like, go to one extreme or the other, where they're so practically minded, that they just do everything they know they can, and anything that happens, they just kind of associate with their own preparation, lack thereof, if it's a failure or whatever like that. And then other people will take the opposite extreme and be like, hey, you know what? God's got this. I'm not going to prepare in any way for what I know is coming at me. I'm just going to let God handle it all. Jesus take the wheel kind of situation to the extreme. Hezekiah is walking a middle ground here. Anyway, looking at chat, you know, starving people out is the worst possible method to get people out of any settlement. Yeah, I mean, worst possible. I'm not entirely sure in what way you mean there, Owl. Most inhumane is what you mean, or like just the worst strategy. Obviously, if the people die of starvation within the city, then they're not going to be leaving the city because they're dead within the city. But again, the point is weakening them, I suppose. Of course, that probably leads to an eventual breaking point, you might say, where people will just feel like they have nothing to lose, and so they'll go out in, you know, desperation and do whatever they think they can. probably all the more aggressively for that reason. Yeah, there was usually there might have been a little bit more to these sieges than just the starvation aspect of things, but that was definitely part of it. But in any case, the water was stopped up outside the city so that it would make it more difficult for the Assyrians to continually occupy that city. It's even evidence that in the founding settlements of North America, when the Native Americans tried starving them out, the settlers resorted to... Yeah, there is that kind of stuff, which, still serves the purpose of weakening the town, but also, when people get really desperate, they'll do things to either end it quicker with more casualties for the sieging side, or they'll do desperate things like that to prolong it even further and make it even more troubling for the attacking side in that way. All right, real quick before I move on, there's a note here in verse 5 when it's talking about supporting terraces. Hebrew says the millow. Now, the meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain, but I guess based on context clues and other references and things like that, that's the educated guess, for lack of a better way to put it, of the translators as far as what the millow means. All right, so defenses have been reinforced in Jerusalem. He's got the army together and has encouraged them to not be afraid of the Assyrians despite their great numbers, because they have God on their side. And then we come to verse 9. While King Sennacherib of Assyria was still besieging the town of Lachish, he sent his officers to Jerusalem with this message for Hezekiah and all the people in the city. This is what King Sennacherib of Assyria says. What are you trusting in that makes you think you can survive my siege of Jerusalem? Hezekiah has said, the Lord our God will rescue us from the king of Assyria. Surely Hezekiah is misleading you, sentencing you to death by famine and thirst. Don't you realize that Hezekiah is the very person who destroyed all the Lord's shrines and altars? He commanded Judah and Jerusalem to worship only at the altar at the temple and to offer sacrifices on it alone. Surely you must realize what I and the other kings of Assyria before me have done to all the people of the earth. Were any of the gods of those nations able to rescue their people from my power? Which of their gods was able to rescue its people from the destructive power of my predecessors? What makes you think your God can rescue you from me? Don't let Hezekiah deceive you. Don't let him fool you like this. I say it again, no god of any nation or kingdom has ever yet been able to rescue his people from me or my ancestors. How much less will your God rescue you from my power? So, long story short, the Assyrian king here is basically flipping Hezekiah's ideas completely on their head, or at least trying to, and being like, well, he says your God can save you, but none of these other gods have saved their people. What, do you really think your God has any kind of chance when these other people's gods failed them? And now it seems to me he's mistaken about the stuff it mentions in verse 12. Because he's saying that Hezekiah destroyed, or miraculously had other people destroy, the Lord's shrines and altars. But those were not shrines. According to the way that it was worded in earlier verses, those were shrines and altars to other gods, not the Lord. But perhaps because of the recent history, he and some other kings might have assumed that those other altars and shrines and things like that were for their god. But no, that wasn't the case. Just because people were worshiping at those altars and shrines doesn't mean that they were places dedicated to the Lord. In fact, there was mention of it not being that way for multiple chapters before we even got to Hezekiah. He also might have made some assumptions based on the other tribes of Israel that he had already conquered, because they didn't worship the Lord really much at any given point in that separate kingdom's existence. But essentially, he's trying to convince the people of Jerusalem to just give up, get out alive while they still can, is kind of what he thinks he's going to convince them to do. But of course, that really just makes it easier for him in the long run, because then more of his opposition has given up, so he's got fewer people to fight, and yeah. Anyway. Okay, so after that kind of threat, we'll say, we get to verse 16. And Sennacherib's officers further mocked the Lord God and his servant Hezekiah, heaping insult upon insult. The king also sent letters scorning the Lord, the God of Israel. He wrote, "Just as the gods of all the other nations failed to rescue their people from my power, so the God of Hezekiah will also fail." The Assyrian officials who brought the letters shouted this in Hebrew to the people gathered on the walls of the city, trying to terrify them so it would be easier to capture the city. These officers talked about the God of Jerusalem as though he were one of the pagan gods made by human hands. Then King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos, cried out in prayer to the God of heaven, to God in heaven. And the Lord sent an angel who destroyed the Assyrian army with all its commanders and officers. So Sennacherib was forced to return home in disgrace to his own land. And when he entered the temple of his God, some of his own sons killed him there with a sword. That is how the Lord rescued Hezekiah and the people of Jerusalem from King Sennacherib of Assyria and from all the others who threatened them. So there was peace throughout the land. From then on, King Hezekiah became highly respected among all the surrounding nations, and many gifts for the Lord arrived at Jerusalem, with valuable presents for King Hezekiah too. The officers essentially took Sennacherib's threats and insults and just tried to amplify them more and more. Sort of like some political commentators will do, sort of parroting, but then even going beyond what their favorite politicians say. Now, it's interesting. I guess they specifically sent their message in Hebrew in order to try their best to make sure that the people of Jerusalem understood it. Now, the Hebrew wording there says in the dialect of Judah. So they might have already been communicating in Hebrew in a way. But, dialects are a little bit different than full-blown languages. You'll get some slightly different uses of certain words, different accents and things like that, all within the same language and whatnot. So I guess it's more that kind of distinction. And that's honestly even more specific, because it says the dialect of Judah. That's who they were attacking here. So again, still kind of holds true to the same point. They were doing their best, these Assyrian officials, to make sure that their message and their insults were understood by the people of Judah, Jerusalem in particular. Essentially then, Hezekiah and Isaiah pray about it, and it just says the Lord sent an angel who destroyed the Assyrian army. Obviously not like 100% of it, because some people still went back, including King Sennacherib. But, like, it doesn't mention any fighting on the part of Hezekiah or the people of Jerusalem. It's also not necessarily as descriptive as some of the times previously that God had just sort of delivered the people without them having to fight. And then it mentions Sennacherib being killed by his own sons. I think there's actually a little more detail on that in 2 Kings, if I recall correctly. So Assyrian invasion unsuccessful, at least, didn't conquer the capital city, thus the kingdom as a whole has not fallen. And I guess because of how much the Assyrians had done to surrounding people and kingdoms and things like that, the fact that he, and really more accurately God, was able to, defeat the Assyrians, it was just like, hold up, this guy has actually knocked our big problem down a peg. Thanks for that. And so there are gifts presented because of that. Alright, yeah, I don't think I had any other thoughts on that section. So, we'll continue with verse 24. About that time, Hezekiah became deathly ill. He prayed to the Lord, who healed him and gave him a miraculous sign. But Hezekiah did not respond appropriately to the kindness shown him, and he became proud. So the Lord's anger came against him and against Judah and Jerusalem. Then Hezekiah humbled himself and repented of his pride, as did the people of Jerusalem. So the Lord's anger did not fall on them during Hezekiah's lifetime. Hezekiah was very wealthy and highly honored. He built special treasury buildings for his silver, gold, precious stones, and spices, and for his shields and other valuable items. He also constructed many storehouses for his grain, new wine, and olive oil. And he made many stalls for his cattle and pens for his flocks of sheep and goats. He built many towns and acquired vast flocks and herds, for God had given him great wealth. He blocked up the upper spring of Gihon and brought the water down through a tunnel to the west side of the city of David. And so he succeeded in everything he did. However, when ambassadors arrived from Babylon to ask about the remarkable events that had taken place in the land, God withdrew from Hezekiah in order to test him and to see what was really in his heart. The rest of the events of Hezekiah's reign and his acts of devotion are recorded in the vision of the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos, which is included in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. When Hezekiah died, he was buried in the upper area of the royal cemetery, and all Judah and Jerusalem honored him at his death. And his son Manasseh became the next king. After God rescued Jerusalem from the Assyrians, it says Hezekiah became deathly ill. And as I recall from 2 Kings, or as I think I recall, he was like he had actually been told by a prophet, possibly even Isaiah, that he was going to die of that illness. But then he prayed about it, and God decided to keep him alive another 15 years because he had been so dedicated. So that was actually, I mean, I think it said back in, what was the first, or did it describe it here? No? Okay. Trying to think of how long it said Hezekiah was king. Ruled in Jerusalem 29 years. So really, like, all things said, he hadn't even gone through half of his eventual reign as king when he became ill like this, and then he got healed and basically had another half of his time as king that he remained alive. And I'm thinking there could have been more details on this stuff in Second Kings, as far as, you know, the pride that came in, and, you know, then Hezekiah humbling himself. Man, I really stumbled over that for a second. And if this Isaiah is the same Isaiah that has a book of the Bible written and named after him, then there's probably even more detail in that. But that comes notably later in the Bible. So Hezekiah continues to build things and acquire wealth and power, I guess you could say. But then these ambassadors from Babylon come around, and this just says God tested him in that situation. Again, if I recall correctly, what happened there was he essentially showed these ambassadors, like, all sorts of stuff about his palace and the temple and all these things that gave them notable knowledge that then eventually gets used against Judah and Jerusalem in particular. But I guess the recap of that is still to come. In case it's not, though, like, Babylon is the kingdom that eventually takes over and rules Judah, possibly even then takes over what the Assyrians had previously conquered, and that Babylon is the empire that caused the exile that God's people were currently experiencing as these chronicles were being told to them. Anyway, not a whole lot to say about this last little section summarizing his reign and his death and whatnot. I assume the upper area of the royal cemetery was, like, kind of where they put the best kings. But other than that, just says his son became the next king. No surprise there. And that kind of does it for chapter 32 here. Alright, so now after 4 whole chapters, the summary or recap, or whatever you want to call it, of Hezekiah's reign has come to an end. And I mean, if you know from Second Kings, it goes kind of up and down from there. But they did, well, God really managed to hold off the Assyrian invasion, since, you know, Hezekiah, and I think it mentioned Isaiah, also prayed about that. And yeah, I mean, the way that it words it, it was all God's doing, though. Thing is, afterwards, Hezekiah kind of opened the possibility of Babylon coming in and taking over, which that does eventually happen, and it kind of, I'm not going to say it was entirely because of, but it was probably made easier by Hezekiah being so friendly to the ambassadors. Maybe a little more friendly than he should have been. But anyway, so yeah, the next chapter, it's going to involve his son as king. We'll see how that goes and see what Ezra thinks about how that went. But anyway, as always, like and share if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell to get updates when I post new videos. Look down in the description for links to my social media pages, Discord server, supporter page, all the places to find my content and interact and even support what I'm doing if you want to do that. But if you'd rather just leave your thoughts and questions right here below the video, just go down to the comment section and leave it there. So as always, I hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see y'all for another video, but whatever the case is, till next time, stay cool, people.